Hi, I'm Clara, and today's story will take you on a journey of betrayal and sweet revenge. I grew up in a house that smelled like lemon cleaner and old books, a place that should have felt safe but never did. My father, quiet, generous, and always a little tired, married my stepmother, Evelyn, when I was 12. Evelyn arrived like a storm in silk, polished, precise, and with a laugh that always landed a beat too late. She had a way of rearranging things, my photos, my books, even the furniture, until the house looked like hers, and I felt like a guest. At first, I told myself it was adjustment. My father seemed happy. He smiled more, he took me out for pancakes on Saturdays, and he called me kiddo in a way that made my chest warm. But warmth can be a trick. Evelyn's kindness had edges. She praised me in public and dismissed me in private. She would correct my posture at dinner, call my clothes too casual, and make jokes about my dramatic teenage phase in front of friends. The small cuts add up. They're the kind that don't leave scars you can point to, but they change how you move through a room. The worst of it was how she treated birthdays. My father always tried to make them special. He would bake a cake, hang a crooked banner, and put a ridiculous hat on my head. Evelyn would hover, offering helpful suggestions that always meant less of him and more of her. On my 16th, she insisted on inviting her friends and then spent the evening telling stories about her own glorious youth, while I sat on the couch and watched my father's eyes flick to me like he wanted to apologize, but didn't know how. By the time I turned 18, the tension had become a low hum. I had a scholarship to a state university, a small savings account from babysitting, and a plan to leave the house as soon as I could. I thought the day I turned 18 would be a quiet marker, legal adulthood, a clean break. Instead, it became the day Evelyn decided to humiliate me. The morning of my birthday, the house smelled like coffee and cinnamon. My father left early for work with a kiss on my forehead and a promise to take me out that evening. Evelyn made pancakes and stacked them like a tower, smiling as if she'd invented joy. She handed me a small box, cheap wrapping, a bow that had been tied by someone who'd done it 100 times. I opened it. Inside was a pair of earrings, pretty, but not what I'd wanted. I forced a smile. She clapped, delighted, and said, "There, now you look more presentable." The party that evening was small. My father, Evelyn, and a neighbor who'd come by with a pie. I sat at a table and tried to keep my voice steady.
We sang.
We ate. Then Evelyn stood up, cleared her throat, and announced she had a surprise. She walked to the mantel and pulled out an envelope, my name written in a looping, practiced hand. My heart did a small, hopeful flip. Maybe my father had planned something. Maybe there was a card with a plain ticket, a note, anything that said he believed in me. Evelyn handed me the envelope with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Open it," she said, and the room leaned in like a tide. I slid my fingers under the flap and unfolded the paper. It was a letter, short, typed, and formal. My father had written it, she said, before he left for work. I read the first line and felt the floor tilt. "Dear Clara," it began. "By the time you read this, you will be 18. I want you to know how proud I am of you. I have left my estate to be divided as follows. To my wife, Evelyn, the house and all personal property. To my daughter, Clara, a token of my love in the form of a small savings account to be accessed at her discretion." I blinked. A token? A small savings account? The words landed like a slap. Evelyn's smile widened. She reached across the table and patted my hand in a way that felt like a seal. "You get nothing," she said, loud enough for the neighbor to hear, and then she laughed, thin, triumphant. My father's face went pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked away. I remember the physical sensation. My throat tightened, my ears buzzed, and my hands went cold. My heart hammered against my ribs like it wanted to escape. I wanted to scream, to tell her she was wrong, to demand to see the will, to make my father look at me and say, "No, that's not right." But the words lodged in my mouth like stones. I swallowed them down and smiled, because smiling is what you do when you're trying to be brave and you don't know any other language. After the neighbor left, the house felt smaller. Evelyn busied herself with the dishes, humming a tune that sounded like victory. My father sat at the kitchen table and stared at the letter as if it were a map he couldn't read. That night, I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. I thought about the scholarship, the savings I'd scraped together, and the way Evelyn's hand had rested on the envelope as if she'd already counted the rooms she'd redecorate. The injustice wasn't just the money. It was the message. You are not worth the same respect, the same future. It was the way Evelyn had turned my birthday into a public declaration of my smallness. I felt undercut, invisible, and furious in a way that made my stomach churn. But fury alone is a messy thing. It needs direction. Over the next few days, I watched Evelyn with a new clarity. She was careful with her words, always framing things as for the best. She criticized my plans for college as ambitious but impractical, and she suggested I might want to stay closer to home, to help around the house. She called my friends flighty and my ambitions cute. Each slight was a pinprick. Each one made me smaller. I started to keep a journal again. Not the teenage scribbles of old, but a ledger of details, dates, conversations, the exact phrasing of the letter. I photographed the envelope, the typed font, the way my father's signature slanted. I did it because anger without evidence is a rumor. If I wanted justice, I needed proof. If I wanted to change the story, I needed to understand the rules of the game Evelyn was playing. And then, on a rainy Tuesday, a letter arrived for me. It was not the kind of letter you expect, no bills, no junk mail. It was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of the cologne my father used to wear. My name was on the front in my father's handwriting. I opened it with hands that trembled and read the first line. Clara, if anything happens to me, read this carefully. The rest of the letter was different from the typed one Evelyn had shown at my birthday. It was messy, full of crossed-out sentences and small, earnest notes. My father wrote about his regrets, about how he'd been afraid to fight for me, because he didn't want to make waves. He admitted he'd signed the typed letter under pressure, thinking it would keep the peace. He wrote that he had set aside a separate account in my name, more than a token, and that the typed letter had been a draft he'd never meant to use. He told me where to find the account number and the lawyer's name. He wrote, "If Evelyn ever says you get nothing, you show her this." I read the letter 3 times. My hands shook. The room seemed to tilt back into place. For the first time since that birthday, I felt something like possibility. The injustice was still there, but now I had a map. I had a way to prove that Evelyn's public declaration was a lie. I had a choice: confront her immediately in a messy, emotional scene, or plan something that would make the truth undeniable and, if possible, make her feel the weight of what she'd done. I chose the latter. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because cruelty is different when it's precise. I wanted the revenge to be clean, to be a mirror that reflected her own behavior back at her. I wanted the payoff to be not just financial but moral, to show the house, the neighbors, and my father that I was not small. I wanted to reclaim my birthday. That night, I folded my father's letter and slid it into my pocket. I slept with my hand over it like a talisman. The plan began to form not as a single idea, but as a series of small, careful moves. I would gather proof. I would secure the account. I would make sure the timing was right. And I would make Evelyn understand, in a way she couldn't laugh off, that words of the days after I found my father's letter were a study in quiet. I moved through the house like someone learning a new language, watching Evelyn's gestures, listening for the cadence of her voice, cataloging the small ways she asserted control. She started to notice my distance and tried to charm me back into the fold with dinners and heart-to-hearts. She would sit across from me, tilt her head, and say, "You know I only want what's best for this family." Her eyes were always a fraction too cool. I played along. I smiled. I accepted her invitations. But I also started to act with a purpose that felt foreign and steady. I called the lawyer my father had mentioned in the letter. I used the account number he'd scribbled and asked questions in a voice that tried to sound casual, but was all nerves. The lawyer confirmed there was an account in my name, funds set aside years ago, untouched. He asked me to come in with identification and a copy of the letter. He warned me about Evelyn's legal savvy. She had a way with documents and a habit of making things look tidy on paper. "Bring everything you have," he said. "We'll make sure it's airtight." I started to collect evidence. I printed bank statements, saved emails, and made a timeline of events. I photographed the typed letter Evelyn had shown at my birthday and compared it to my father's messy note. The fonts were different. The signatures didn't match. The typed letter had a lawyer's letterhead that, when I called, turned out to be a draft the lawyer had never finalized. The more I dug, the more it became clear that Evelyn had staged the birthday moment to humiliate me and to position herself as the primary beneficiary. Anger sharpened into focus. But alongside it was a quieter thing, a sense of strategy. I realized that revenge, to be satisfying, needed more than exposure. It needed timing and theater. Evelyn thrived on spectacle, her parties, her carefully curated social media, the way she loved to be seen as the gracious hostess. If I wanted her to feel the sting, I had to use the same stage she loved. I began to plan. The first step was to secure the account. The lawyer arranged a meeting and told me the funds could be transferred into a trust that would be mine to access for education and living expenses. He also suggested we prepare a formal letter to Evelyn and my father, laying out the facts and the legal standing. "You don't have to be dramatic," he said, "but you should be clear and firm." Dramatic or not, I wanted the moment to be undeniable. I wanted neighbors to know. I wanted the house to feel different. So I decided to wait for a moment when Evelyn would be most exposed, when she would have an audience, and when her reaction would be public. That meant patience. It meant pretending to be small while I was anything, but during this time, Evelyn escalated her behavior in ways that made my plan feel necessary. She started to micromanage my father's schedule, insisting he skip his weekly poker night because we have plans. She criticized the way I loaded the dishwasher, the way I folded towels, the way I spoke to guests. Once, she invited a group of her friends over for tea and, in the middle of a story, turned to me and said, "Clara is so lucky to have a mother figure now. She was always a bit lost before." The laughter that followed was soft but sharp. I felt my face flush and my hands clench under the table. I kept my cool. I smiled and poured tea. Inside, I rehearsed the moment I would reveal the truth. I imagined Evelyn's face when the house's narrative, her narrative, crumbled. I imagined my father looking at me and finally seeing me as more than a footnote. I imagined the neighbors whispering and the social media posts that would follow. The fantasy was intoxicating, but I tempered it with reality. Legal steps, documentation, and the need to protect my father from a confrontation that might break him. One night, as I sat at my desk with the lawyer's paperwork spread out like a map, my father knocked on my door. He looked older than his years, the lines around his eyes deeper. He sat down and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were small but heavy. He told me he'd been afraid of Evelyn's temper, of the fights that would follow if he resisted. He said he'd thought signing the typed letter would keep the peace, and that he regretted it every day. He told me he'd written the messy letter because he couldn't bear the idea of me being left with nothing. I wanted to hug him and tell him it was okay, but the hug would have been for both of us. Instead, I squeezed his hand and said, "We'll fix this." The resolve in my voice surprised me. It felt like armor. The lawyer moved faster than I expected. He set up the trust, verified the account, and prepared a formal notice to Evelyn that outlined the facts, the existence of the account, the intent behind it, and the legal steps we were taking to secure it. He suggested a public moment to deliver the notice, something that would make it impossible for Evelyn to spin the story. "A family gathering," he said. "A dinner. She likes those. Make it a moment she can't control." I thought of birthdays, of the way Evelyn loved to orchestrate them. I thought of the neighbor who'd laughed at my expense. I thought of the small, private humiliations that had accumulated. I decided to use the next family event as the stage, my father's retirement party. He'd been planning it for months, and Evelyn had been gleeful about the guest list. It would be the perfect place, friends, neighbors, and the kind of social proof Evelyn craved. In the weeks leading up to the party, I played the part of the dutiful daughter. I helped with invitations, I baked a cake, and I smiled through Evelyn's commentary about my newly practical life plans. I also made sure the lawyer's letter was ready and that the trust transfer would be complete the morning of the party. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would hand the envelope to Evelyn, and how I would keep my voice steady. The night before the party, Evelyn came into my room unannounced. She stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, and said, "You've been distant. Are you sulking because of that little savings account?" Her tone was mocking, the kind that seeks a reaction. My heart thudded. I could have snapped. I could have told her everything. Instead, I smiled and said, "I'm just tired. Big day tomorrow." She laughed and left, satisfied. I lay awake thinking about the next day. I felt a strange mix of nerves and calm. The plan was in motion. The legal pieces were in place. The stage was set. But plans are fragile things. They can be derailed by emotion, by a misstep, by a sudden change. I promised myself I would not let that happen. I would be precise. I would be patient. And when the moment came, I would let the truth do the work. On the morning of the party, the house buzzed with activity. Evelyn flitted from room to room, adjusting napkins and checking the guest list. My father sat in his chair, reading the paper with a contented look. I felt the trust transfer confirmation ping on my phone like a small, bright bell. The funds were secure. The lawyer texted, "Ready when you are." I folded the formal notice into an envelope and tucked it into my bag. My hands were steady. When guests began to arrive, the house filled with the kind of polite chatter that makes you forget the undercurrents. Evelyn greeted everyone with practiced warmth. She wore a dress that made her look like she belonged on a magazine cover. She moved through the room like a conductor, and I watched her, cataloging every smile, every tilt of the head. The moment was close. I could feel it like a held breath. I waited until dessert, when the room had settled and people were sipping coffee. I stood, cleared my throat, and asked for everyone's attention. The room turned. Evelyn's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, enough for me to see the human beneath the polish. I reached into my bag, pulled out the envelope, and walked toward her. "Evelyn," I said, my voice steady. "There's something you should read." I handed her the envelope. The room hummed. She opened it, scanned the letter, and her face changed in a way that made the air go thin. The laughter that had once followed her words died. My father looked up, and for the first time in years, his eyes met mine with clarity. The letter was short and legal, but its effect was dramatic. It stated the trust, the funds, and the legal steps taken. It made Evelyn's earlier declaration, "You get nothing," look like a cruel, performative lie. The room shifted. People leaned in. I felt the weight of every small humiliation lift like a fog. Evelyn's reaction was immediate and raw. She stood, her face flushing, and said, "This is ridiculous. You can't," her voice cracked. She tried to laugh it off, to call it a misunderstanding, but the evidence was there. The lawyer's name, the bank confirmation, the dates. The truth was a mirror she couldn't break. I watched her try to salvage the moment, to spin it into something else, but the audience had already chosen a side. The neighbors exchanged looks. My father's friends murmured. Evelyn's friends shifted uncomfortably. The social currency she'd relied on, admiration, control, the ability to set the narrative, crumbled in a single, quiet moment. I felt a strange release, like a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding. The revenge wasn't a shout, it was a reveal. It was the slow, satisfying unmasking of someone who'd built her power on other people's smallness. I had not shouted. I had not screamed. When Evelyn realized the room had turned, she did what she always did. She tried to control the narrative. She smoothed her dress, laughed too loudly, and said, "There must be some mistake." Her voice had the brittle edge of someone who knows their script has been ripped up. She looked at my father as if to find an ally, but his face was a map of regret and something else. Relief, maybe, that the truth was finally out. Evelyn's first instinct was to deny. She accused me of theatrics, of trying to embarrass her. She said, "You're making a scene." But the scene had already been made by her. The typed letter she'd brandished on my birthday was now a prop in a story that had been exposed as false. The neighbors who had once admired her poise now watched her with the same curiosity you reserve for a magician whose trick has failed. She tried to pivot to charm, to apologize in a way that sounded rehearsed. "I'm sorry if anyone was offended," she said, but the apology was thin. People could see it. My father stood up slowly and walked to the center of the room. He took my hand and, for the first time in public, he said, "Clara, I'm so sorry." His voice trembled. The apology was small, but it was real. Evelyn's face went white. She had always relied on the house as proof of her place, its rooms, its decor, the way she hosted. Now those things felt like evidence against her. She tried to laugh, to make a joke, but the laughter died in her throat. Her friends shifted, and one by one, they began to look at her differently. The social scaffolding she'd built, admiration, influence, the ability to make others feel small, began to creak. The lawyer stepped forward and explained, in calm, precise terms, the legal standing of the trust and the steps we'd taken. He answered questions with a clarity that left no room for Evelyn's spin. People asked about the account, about the timeline, and the lawyer provided documents. The room felt like a courtroom, and Evelyn was on the stand. She tried to argue that my father had been confused, that the typed letter had been a draft, that she'd only meant to protect the family. But the messy, handwritten letter my father had written, his admission of fear and his intent, was the anchor. It showed motive and context. It showed that the typed letter had been a performance, not a legal truth. As the conversation unfolded, I watched Evelyn's composure unravel. She grew defensive, then angry, then small. She accused me of betrayal, of trying to ruin her life. Her voice rose, and for a moment, she looked like the woman who'd once stood over me and declared I would get nothing. But this time, the audience didn't laugh with her. They watched her with a mixture of pity and disbelief. The neighbors who had once admired her for her hosting skills now whispered about her cruelty. Her friends, who had once mirrored her opinions, began to distance themselves. The social currency she'd relied on, admiration, influence, the ability to make others feel small, began to evaporate. It was a slow, delicious thing to witness, the unmaking of a persona built on other people's humiliation. After the initial shock, Evelyn retreated to the kitchen. She slammed a cupboard door so hard the plates rattled. I heard her sob once, sharp and private, and then the house settled into a different rhythm. People lingered, offering condolences to my father, asking if he was okay. I answered questions with a calm I didn't entirely feel. Inside, my chest was a tangle of triumph and sorrow. Revenge had a cost. It didn't erase the years of small wounds. It didn't fix the nights I'd spent feeling invisible. But it did change the story. In the days that followed, the fallout continued. Evelyn stopped hosting her weekly bridge club. Her friends called less. She tried to maintain normalcy, making coffee, arranging flowers, but the house felt different. People who had once deferred to her now asked my father questions directly. He seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. He started to take walks again, to laugh at small things, to call me in the middle of the day just to tell me about a bird he'd seen. Those moments felt like small victories. Evelyn, for her part, became quieter. She stopped making public jabs. She avoided eye contact. Once, she passed me in the hallway and said, "I didn't mean," but she didn't finish. I nodded. I didn't need her apology. The point had never been to humiliate for the sake of humiliation. The point had been to reclaim dignity, and to make sure the truth had a voice. There were practical consequences, too. The trust provided me with a means to accept my scholarship without fear. I moved into a small apartment near campus, carrying only a few boxes and a sense of possibility. My father helped me move, and we laughed at the ridiculousness of the boxes labeled kitchen that contained nothing but mismatched mugs. He hugged me at the door and said, "You deserve better." I cried then, quiet, relieved tears. The revenge had been satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't a dramatic public shaming with a mic drop. It was a careful, legal, and moral unmasking that left no room for Evelyn's usual spin. It felt earned because it was built on truth and preparation. It felt fair because it exposed the harm she'd done, without stooping to her level. But the emotional payoff was more complicated. I had imagined a moment of pure triumph. Evelyn's face crumpling, the neighbors gasping, my father standing proudly by my side. That happened in part. But there was also a tenderness in my father's apology, a sadness in Evelyn's retreat, and a recognition that people are messy. Revenge didn't make everything neat. It made the scales tip back toward balance, but it also left room for complexity. Months later, I received a letter from Evelyn. It was short and formal. She wrote that she was moving to a smaller house, and that she hoped we could find a way to coexist. She didn't apologize in the way I wanted. No admission of cruelty, no acknowledgement of the small wounds she'd inflicted. But she did write, "I'm sorry for the pain this has caused." It was a small thing, but it was something. I replied with a letter of my own. I didn't gloat. I didn't list grievances. I wrote about boundaries and respect. I wrote that I forgave her in the sense that I would no longer let her define me. I told her I hoped she would find a way to be kinder to herself. The letter felt like a closing of a chapter rather than a final blow. In the quiet that followed, I learned something about justice and about myself. Justice, I realized, is not always about punishment. Sometimes it's about truth being heard and about reclaiming your story. Sometimes it's about creating a life where you are seen and respected. Revenge can be a tool for that, but it must be wielded with care. I also learned that strength can be quiet. The most satisfying moments were not the loud ones, but the ones where the truth did the work. I had been underestimated for years, and the payoff was not just the money or the social vindication. It was the knowledge that I could stand up for myself, that I could plan, prepare, and act with integrity. You don't have to accept the story someone else writes about you. Gather your evidence. Find allies. Be patient. And when the moment is right, let the truth speak. Sometimes justice is loud, and sometimes it's quiet. For me, it was a letter, a lawyer, and the courage to let the truth be seen. The sweetest part wasn't watching her fall. It was watching my father stand up and finally see me.